Thank you, Michael. Warner Norcross and Judd is proud to be a supporter of the World Affairs Council, and we're excited to host another speaker with deep knowledge and expertise in the topic at hand. Hiroko Muraki-Gottlieb has over 20 years of legal and policy expertise, covering a broad range of sustainability and international matters. She is currently the representative for the ocean at the International Council of Environmental Law, professor of environmental law at Pace University, and an associate of the Department of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology at Harvard University. She is also the Senior Ocean Governance Advisor for the Global Marine Polar Program at the International Union of Conservation of Nature, or IUCN. She is a fellow at the Global Center of Environmental Legal Studies at Haub Law and a member of IUCN's World Commission on Environmental Law. In her capacity as representative for the ocean, Ms. Muraki-Gottlieb leads an International Council of Environmental Law delegation at the United Nations Intergovernmental Conference on an internationally legally binding instrument under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which addresses the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. Professor Muraki-Gottlieb also has experience in the private sector, including her previous role as Chargé d'Affaires and Senior Counselor of the Permanent Observer Mission of the International Chamber of Commerce at the United Nations, and as counsel for IBM's Corporate Environmental Affairs. She was with the law firm Robinson & Cole prior to joining IBM, specializing in the environmental law practice. Her presentation tonight is titled, "The UN High Seas Treaty and Protecting Our Global Commons." Let's welcome Hiroko Muraki-Gottlieb.
Okay, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for the generous and warm introduction. And I am so happy to be here this evening to talk about my favorite topic, the High Seas Treaty. The reason why this is my favorite topic is not because I've been deeply involved in this, but it's a story about hope, and it is a story about how countries with different needs, desires, and resources come together to tackle a very, very difficult problem. So I like to start with this picture. This is the first sighting of the Earth, taken in 1969. And with this picture, we've come to understand that the Earth is not green, but it's actually blue. And I love this photo because it represents how the ocean is one. A lot of times you hear the word oceans or seas, and scientists actually prefer to call the ocean just a single ocean because seas and oceans represent political representation of this incredible biodiversity, while the term ocean represents the united and integrated biodiversity that we really have. So how is the ocean governed? There was a series of discussions at the United Nations about how to govern our ocean, starting from within national boundaries and also going out to areas beyond national jurisdiction. So there's a long history of discussions and negotiations, but a breakthrough came in the third UN Conference of the Law of the Sea in 1982, and the negotiations were Herculean, but the countries were able to come up with 320 articles and annexes, and it really established the rules governing all matters of the sea. And it was really amazing because on the first day alone, 191 countries signed the agreement. And that really represents what the countries can do when they're faced with a dauntingly complex issue, but they come to recognize that countries have to work together. And so a preamble in a treaty is something that talks about the overall aspirations and a vision of the agreement. And it really, and this is one of the preamble provisions, which says the problems of the ocean space are closely interrelated and need to be considered as a whole. And so even back when the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or the Constitution for the Ocean, was drafted, there was recognition that ocean is one. And at the time, the countries really tried to come up with a comprehensive, 320 articles is quite a bit, and the document is this thick in case you ever want to read it. And there was recognition that the document was not perfect, but the countries really tried to make it future-proof, meaning that this convention is going to be in place for a long, long time. Let's make sure that we're looking into the future to make sure that we have a document that can evolve over time. And so that was really the intention. However, things change, and many of the changes are due to different, the changes that are made in the biodiversity, or there are lack of understanding that was part of the problem that occurred during drafting. So now there's clarifications that need to be made, and so forth. So what happened was, under the Convention on the Law of the Sea, there were two implementing agreements that were negotiated and adopted. The first is the Straddling Fish Stocks Agreement, or the Fish Stocks Agreement. And the second one was on the deep seabed mining. I don't know, you might have read about it in the newspapers about the controversy over deep seabed mining of minerals. But it was in, the Fish Stocks Agreement was adopted in 1995 and went into force in 2001. The Deep Seabed Mining Agreement was adopted in 1994 and went into force in 1996. So these are some of the ways that countries deal with changes or needs or the lack of clarification that need to be part of rules and understanding that will allow countries to better implement what's already in the books in the Convention on the Law of the Sea. So since that time, there's been a lot of changes that has been happening. Of course, today, it's been beautiful to be here because it's 70 degrees, but we are in February. And so it does worry me a little bit in terms of climate change. But one of the things that I found really scary is just the extent of the heat that the ocean has been absorbing. So this is a newspaper article from 2022 where it says that the ocean has absorbed heat equivalent to 7 Hiroshima nuclear explosions every second, which, you know, if you know about the bomb, it's so hot that it can turn objects into shadows. So that is the amount of heat that the ocean has been absorbing, which is equivalent to 93% of the anthropogenic, or the heat that we generate from our everyday activities. And that does create issues. So if you look at the chart here, you can see that the heat content in the ocean has been increasing rapidly, and we're in a trajectory that we're breaking records every single year. And this study that is issued every year, Cheng's study, shows that we, again, last year broke in record in ocean heat. And you can see from this that the heat distribution, or the increase in heat, is is not uniform. It really attacks certain parts of the world. And also, salinity of the ocean water changes. And the changes in the temperature is just not superficial. It goes way deep into the ocean. So in addition to heat, according to the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, 31% of carbon dioxide that is generated by our daily activities are absorbed by the ocean. And of course, this is not with consequences. In fact, the increased absorption of carbon dioxide changes the pH balance, which means that it makes the ocean more acidic. And according to the EPA, the ocean, on average, is about 25% more acidic than it was during pre-industrial times. And also, the ocean is losing oxygen due to ocean warming. And according to the UC San Diego's Scripps Institute of Oceanography, this professor Lisa Levin, who has been in this space for a long time and has been involved with the climate change and ocean nexus studies. And she's written this article that the loss of oxygen has a wide range of impacts, including reducing the quality and quantity of habitat, reducing growth rate of marine life, and even changing visual functions and interfering with reproduction and increasing disease susceptibility. And of course, on top of all of that, we have pollution, including plastic pollution, as well as unsustainable uses such as overfishing. And also, there are concerns about future unsustainable activities. There are talks about using geoengineering the ocean to fight climate change, but we don't know what kind of impact that would have. So in 2015, the United Nations issued its first World Ocean Assessment. And for this report, hundreds of scientists from many countries representing various disciplines assess the state of the knowledge of our ocean and how humans benefit from it and how we are damaging it. And the study found that the ocean's carrying capacity is near or at its limit and concluded that the greatest threat comes from inaction and that we will not be able to continue to benefit from the ocean's bounties. And since then, I know this is just bad news, a parade of bad news. Since then, scientists have been sounding alarm. Report after report call for urgent action. The IPCC, the Special Report on the Ocean and Cryosphere, the Second World Ocean Assessment, the Convention on Biological Diversity Report, and so forth. The state of the ocean health is declining rapidly. But at the same time, we've always relied on the ocean. We rely on the ocean for our food and recreation. We were just talking about diving. But in fact, even our breath, 50% of the oxygen that we breathe comes from the ocean. So the ocean health is really important for our survival. And just bring it down to the national level, NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, says that the coastal communities in the US are home to over 127 million people, 40% of the population. And in 2019, the American blue economy, so this is a type of economic activities tied to the ocean, grew faster than the nation's economy in its entirety, supporting 2.4 million jobs and contributing $397 billion to the nation's gross domestic product. And so NOAA actually has a blue economy strategy from 2021 to next year, 2025. And in fact, they recently came up with this concept of the new blue economy, which focuses on more of the emerging technologies and digital information to support sustainable blue economy. So it's the high seas and the ocean is really close to everyone's everyday activities, in fact. Now, why the high seas? So why were countries really interested in the high seas and coming up with an agreement about it? So this is the picture that represents areas that are beyond any country's national boundaries. So if you look at, this is kind of hard, but if you look at the lighter colors, that represents areas that are global commons. It doesn't belong to any country, it belongs to all. And it represents nearly 2/3 of the ocean, the largest biodiversity of the planet. Now, so then the question must be asked, why do we need another agreement? Why do we need another implementing agreement? So the activities in the high seas are managed by various organizations based on the framework of the Convention on the Law of the Sea. And these organizations have specific power to manage their designated activities, but there's no global approach. Their mandate is narrow, and they have different geographical coverages and membership. There are differing priorities, limited capacity, and limited understanding of ecological connectivity and limited coordination. So that was one of the gaps that the countries identified as something that an implementing agreement may be able to solve. Another concern that came about was that in the convention, there are provisions about providing capacity building and the transfer of marine technology to countries with less resources. However, it has not been effectively delivered, and it's ad hoc sort of initiatives here and there, and the developing countries have been very concerned about that, and they felt that there's lack of commitment from those countries with resources. In addition, there are concerns about the ability of countries, developed country scientists who can go out to the high seas and collect marine creatures or organisms, tiny organisms, and then conduct research, and eventually, for example, a pharmaceutical company could take the research materials or the organism and then create blockbuster drugs, or it could be any other type of commercial success. And developing countries started saying, well, it's not fair that a particular scientist or a company from a developed country would take something from our global commons and benefit without sharing those benefits. So all those concerns from the high seas have been bubbling up. But one thing that the countries could agree on is that there has to be conservation and sustainable use of this largest ecosystem of the planet, not only for the present, but for the future and in the long term. So of course that was, the countries knew that, but what is going to be covered by this implementing agreement, and how will those clarified obligations be implemented? And it took 20 years for the countries to come up with the details to solve this problem of better high seas governance. And it was study upon study. So it started out in 2004 as this informal way of information exchange, and there were scientists and NGOs involved in highlighting the biodiversity degradation and how better governance of the high seas would be able to reverse the conditions. But because the new agreement would require additional regulations, the countries were not entirely on board. So it took a lot of effort by the scientific community, the NGO, and non-governmental organizations, intergovernmental organizations, to continue to push to strengthen the political will for the countries to move forward and decide to come up with a new agreement. Now, I got involved in 2016, and at the time, there was this committee called the Preparatory Committee, and that just represented all countries and also observers such as NGOs and IGOs and academia and research institutions. And there was really no clear idea or vision that there would be a treaty. There was a lot of pushback, and some countries were adamant that a new implementing agreement was not necessary. But those who were supportive of the treaty really worked on raising the political will to get the countries thinking about what the gaps are, what are the lessons that we've learned from the previous implementing agreements, the fish stocks agreement and the deep sea bed mining agreement. And also, countries were looking at other multilateral environmental agreements, such as Convention on Biological Diversity. And so there were ideas about what not to do and what should be included in this agreement. So now, what will this treaty do? It's designed to do quite a bit. As I said, there are various organizations governing the high seas right now with limited mandates. This agreement will come up with a global vision. It comes up with objectives, principles, and approaches that the countries that ratify and become a party to the agreement will be able to use so that everyone's on the same page. There is going to be provisions about area-based management tools, including marine protected areas. So area-based management tools and marine protected areas are ways to better conserve certain areas, designated areas of the ocean, and scientists believe that more protection there is in terms of areas of the high seas, the better that the ocean will be able to recover and to be able to be resilient to climate change. Another thing that the treaty will do is it will require environmental impact assessment before an activity takes place if a threshold is met. So if there are concerns that a certain activity is going to cause significant harm to that part of the ocean, then there has to be steps to make sure that a proper scientific assessment is done and to think about alternatives and various options. There's also going to be a provision about strategic environmental assessment. The environmental impact assessment is more at the project level. The strategic environmental assessment looks more at the area in an integrated way. So it could set a map, or it could set vision or allocation of uses over time. Another thing that the treaty will do is to foster cooperation. These organizations with different mandates and different capacities and so forth, it's really important that they work together, especially to consider how some of the activities are impacting the area that they're governing. Another thing that the treaty will do is to foster the capacity and increase the transfer of marine technology to the countries that need it. And as I discussed earlier, in terms of the commercial success that certain private sector are gaining or thought to be gaining from research that occurs in the high seas, there will be certain types of benefit sharing associated with that. But at the same time, the countries really, both developing countries recognize that it's really important to have an agreement that is going to foster science and collaboration among the scientific community. And it was amazing that various scientific communities came together to provide objective and science-based information to the policymakers, because the policymakers themselves, many of them, or I would say most of them, are not scientists. They do not conduct research out in the high seas or use materials from the high seas. They're strictly policy or legal experts. So a law cannot be drafted in a vacuum. So there is a lot of participation by the scientists and also NGO communities. So there are many, many things that the treaty is going to do. But in order for those requirements to be successful, there has to be some sort of an infrastructure. So the countries agreed that there would be the conference of the parties. So the parties would come together to a meeting to decide on various aspects of implementation. And also there will be review of how the implementation is going. If there are any things that need to be changed, they will be talked about and decided at the conference of the parties. There will be a designated secretariat. Currently, or the negotiations took place in New York at the United Nations headquarters, but the secretariat may be based elsewhere, and so we shall see how that goes. There'll be a scientific and technical body, and so forth. So the reason why we have this strong infrastructure is, again, based on the lessons learned from other agreements where there was no strong infrastructure, and that the implementation of the obligations have not been successful. So where are we now? We have 87 signatories, 86 countries, and the 87th is the European Union. We have 2 ratifications, so countries that went through the process of going beyond signature. So there are 2 countries. The first one was Palau, population of approximately 10,000, and the second country is Chile. And what has to happen is that there has to be 60 parties for the agreement to come and to enter into force. So that is the work that's ongoing right now. And so after the agreement enters into force, there's going to be the first conference of the parties. And to have a very successful first conference of the parties meeting, there has to be a lot of work that has to be done between now and then. So of course the ratification comes first, and then entry into force comes, and then the countries have to be prepared for a successful first conference of the parties. So it's going to be prepare from various meetings, and there has to be very strong political will to keep the countries going. So the High Seas Treaty was negotiated by really talented and incredibly dedicated negotiators supported by IGOs, NGOs, indigenous peoples and local communities, academia, scientific institutions, and so forth, and philanthropies, of course. And every word in, this document, this is the treaty, was negotiated. And it took the unwavering resolve and resilience of negotiators to fill the gaps in the current implementation of the regulations that will contribute to a healthier ocean. So as I started out this talk, this treaty is about hope. And during the past 20 years, while the countries prepared for these negotiations and entered into negotiations, the countries at various levels have experienced unprecedented natural disasters, conflicts, and economic collapse. And collectively, we trudged through an awful pandemic. Yet the negotiators really never lost hope of a new treaty that is going to change the course of the largest ecosystem of the Earth. So we need the countries to take the next steps to sign, ratify, and deposit the treaty with the United Nations to become a party, so we can achieve the critical mass, the 60 parties. And we urgently need to move towards implementation, effective implementation. And the Earth will continue to evolve with or without us. And the future is actually in our hands in this agreement. And I do hope that the countries will give ourselves and our future generations the tools to allow us to succeed for generations to come. So with that, thank you very much to all the co-sponsors. I just wanted to share the website that I created with my colleague, Professor Peter Gerges at Harvard University. If you want to learn more about the treaty and some of the challenges and some of the technical aspects, you can go to this website to find out more. So with that, thank you.
Hiroko, thank you very much. Fascinating conversation. We'll take questions with raised hands or online, 616-308-6560. And I'm wondering, Hiroko, when we hear about the high seas, we're hearing about what's going on in the Red Sea right now. We're hearing about pirates on the African coast. We're hearing about South China Sea. The High Seas Treaty is not dealing with those kinds of dilemmas, or is it?
It could deal from different angles. Actually, I have a student I teach a course in ocean and coast law, and he's part of Navy JAG, and we were talking about the South China Sea. And one of the things that this treaty could do is to require future installation of facilities and so forth in the high seas to have, for the proponent to conduct an environmental impact assessment should there be an issue in terms of significant harm to that area. So there are ways to go around, not directly, but there may be ways to impact future activities that way. And that actually is one of the concerns of countries like China.
Thank you for coming. A question is, will the treaty, if enabled, only apply to international waters, or will the countries that are signing up also commit to doing that in their own coastal regions?
Very good question. So most of the requirements will be in the high seas, so areas beyond national jurisdiction. The only exception is that if there are activities within national jurisdiction that may have significant impacts to the high seas, that kind of activity may need to go through an environmental impact assessment study. So that would be the only exception.
Would that be like in Japan when they had the tsunami effect plants there? That would be an example of that?
It could be, yes. In fact, the negotiators were thinking about that. It was a very challenging issue because the thing about the implementing agreement, the High Seas Treaty, is that it has to balance the the nation's rights and also the common interests. And so any requirement that would interfere with the country's rights within their national borders becomes very contentious. But the incident in Fukushima and the Japanese government releasing the contaminated waters was, I understand, to be one of the inspiration for including this provision where impacts from within national jurisdiction into the high seas would be maybe under regulation.
Got a text question. Is underwater noise pollution considered a serious enough problem to be addressed by the treaty's terms? And if so, what does it say?
Very good question. Yes, it could be. So it could be addressed or considered in the environmental impact assessment or strategic environment assessment. It could also be considered as part of the regulations on area-based management tools, including marine protected areas. So it could be a factor. It could be a major factor if it's impacting, if it's going to cause significant harm to the biodiversity. It could be, noise could be considered in particular sensitive areas or marine reserve, which is the most protective level of protection. Noise could be considered as part of one of the impacts that need to be controlled in that particular area.
Two quick questions. First, a clarification. 87 countries have signed the treaty. Were there any big holdouts or concerns? Did all the heavyweight countries basically sign up?
Yes, that's a very good question. So my own country, Japan, has not signed, but my understanding is that they were working on it. The US has signed fairly early on, but signature is one thing, ratification is another. So there are 86 countries that signed, and when the signatures opened, the first 3 days had the most number of signatories, and then the numbers sort of dwindled. But all we need are 60 parties, so 60 countries to ratify. And it doesn't have to be the US, Japan, although the UK has signed. So we just need 60.
But how will it impact if a country hasn't signed or ratified, but 60 have? How will it impact those who haven't? How will they be held accountable for complying with the treaty?
That's a very good question. So just like any other multilateral environmental agreements, those who are not parties cannot attend or vote or have a say in things that are decided at the conference of the parties, for example. So the countries that do not ratify and become a party do miss out on future decisions that will be made. On the other hand, if there are major maritime, countries like the U.S., for example, that do not ratify, it will impact the, for example, the capacity building and transfer of marine technology requirements that are in the treaty. So it is really important that countries with resources become a party, and it's also in their best interest to do so.
So we need to advocate for countries to sign.
Absolutely, yes.
One last question, if I may. You mentioned deep sea mining.
Yes.
What impact do you anticipate this treaty would have on deep sea mining?
Very, very sensitive question. So deep seabed mining is regulated under another implementing agreement that came before this treaty. And it has its own governing structure with institutional arrangement. It has the International Seabed Authority, it has its own secretariat, it has its legal and technical committee, and the ISA was very vocal in ensuring that their mandates and their powers would not be interfered with this treaty. There has been a lot of concerns coming, especially from the scientific community, that any deep seabed mining activities will cause extreme harm in very sensitive areas in the deep sea, and that there's only, I think, about 5% of the ocean that the scientists have been able to discover. And so there's so much more out there that the scientists could learn about, and perhaps there could be, medicine that could come from it, or new ideas. And if it's destroyed, it's going to be destroyed for hundreds of years. So there's a lot of movement towards moratoriums, and so the ISA is already concerned about that. The treaty could have an impact in terms of how they conduct their activities. So right now, there's only exploration, so there's not exploitation. Because there's no regulation. They're currently negotiating the exploitation regulations. And those who are pushing more for conservation and sustainable use are saying, why don't we, because the countries, it's really the same countries who are in the deep seabed mining space and the high seas treaty space, why not try to harmonize and bring in some of the strong provisions from the High Seas Treaty into the exploitation regulations that are being currently negotiated, but it's still under negotiation.
This is actually a follow-up text question. Perhaps you could discuss a bit of what's been discovered so far about genetic resources in the high seas.
Very interesting question. So the benefit sharing aspect of the treaty covers genetic resources. So marine genetic resources is a term that policymakers use, scientists don't. So there's a definition of MGRs, but so the idea is that organism will be pulled from the high seas, and the genetic properties from that organism will be studied. And that the information about the scientists going out to the high seas should be shared, and the research should be shared. And also that any data and also studies results should be shared. And so those are all non-monetary benefits that will be covered under the High Seas Treaty. Also, there will be discussions in the conference of the parties about monetary benefit sharing, and how that will play out is still a question. But it's interesting because there were so many contentious discussions about marine genetic resources, but scientists are telling us that there may be potential, but a lot of the discoveries are being done within national jurisdiction. And so going out to the high seas is extremely expensive, and so countries are turning within for discoveries. But that doesn't mean that there won't be further studies or increased or accelerated studies in the high seas, because there's a lot of extreme environments there that organisms thrive in, and that could lead to scientific discoveries. So we shall see.
Can you tell us if you don't sign up, you won't be part of the decision-making and so forth. But if you don't sign up, you're not part of a treaty of which you're obligated to follow. So is there anything in the law of the sea here, which allows for collective action against the parties that aren't even part or signatory of it, but they're violating the principles of the law of the sea. So, for example, to have something to pick on, these factory ships that go fishing, and so it could be from a country that has not signed up, or it could be that, as they've used to do a lot and still do some, they just run up a flag from Paraguay or somewhere and declare, you can't do anything to us. Is there any authority for Coast Guards to go out and seize those types of operations to take collective action in response to either private companies or countries violating the requirements and rules of the law of the sea?
That's a very interesting question, and this is where it gets into the regional fisheries management organizations and their mandates, limited mandates, and how the treaty requirements may need to be incorporated into their practices. And IUU, the illegal unlicensed fisheries question, is a very sensitive one. And in terms of countries that are not part of it, so the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, I mean, the U.S. is not a party, but the U.S. considers the convention to be customary international law, meaning that there are so many countries, 170 whatever countries that are already part of it and practicing and implementing the law, that it's now become customary that every country has to follow the requirements most of the requirements in conventional law of the sea. The U.S. is not supportive of deep seabed mining regulations, especially the benefit sharing part. So it will really depend on how many signatories, not signatory, but parties will have in this treaty. And if the number of parties increase and the practice of the High Seas Treaty requirements become so pervasive, it could be considered customary international law, and everyone would have to follow it. So I hope that answers your question. Yes?
If you know, and I might speculate, what are the primary reasons that the countries that have signed but have not ratified offer up as reasons to sit on the sideline and not ratify at this point?
It's interesting. I was having a discussion about this with one of the diplomats in a certain country that I will not disclose, but countries are working on it, but every country has to consider how its international agreement would impact their national legislation. They have to consider if there's going to, for example, there's going to be requirements about environmental impact assessment. They have to understand, okay, what is our current capacity at the national level? Who is doing what? And should there be a requirement for environmental impact assessment, who's going to do that? How much money, how much budget has to be allocated? And what national legal changes need to be made? And it really depends on the country's legal system. And of course, there has to be political will, but more complex the legal system is, the more difficult it is to ratify. And of course, if there has to be a vote to get the law ratified, that could take a significant amount of effort. For example, the U.S. signed the Conventional Law of the Sea, but it failed to ratify. So it wasn't from lack of effort. Sometimes political will gets in the way.
So the U.S. has not ratified either of these, right?
U.S. has signed UNCLOS, Conventional Law of the Sea, and the High Seas Treaty. The U.S. is a party to the Fish Stocks Agreement. And so it really depends on what the national interests are, how strong that is, and of course the government at the time, who's in power, who's in charge, and so forth. And everyone's voices count, you know. So if you talk to your legislators and believe that this is something that, you know, political will can be, would really help to accelerate the U.S.'s ratification, then yeah, it's something that everyone can do.
Okay, so we've been talking about the difficulties of getting parties to ratify. So what is your thought on how long that could take and like the likelihood of it? Like, is it another 20-year stretch, or what's your central feeling on that?
Right. So the United Nations has been having this ocean conference, and it is a conference to gather all the stakeholders to not only understand the state of the ocean health, but also to have voluntary actions to get people excited about ocean conservation and sustainable use. The third UN Ocean Conference is going to happen in Nice in June of 2025. So the host country is very keen to have 60 ratifications by then. And also NGOs and IGOs, and I'm actually part of an informal small group workshop that I will be hosting. And so there are a lot of different initiatives happening, but June of 2025 is going to be very, very tough for 60 countries. So what's happening right now is that countries are advancing their ratification goal, but at various levels. And the less resources the countries have, the more time they will need. So NGOs, IGOs, and other champion countries are helping those countries that need support. So we'll see, but it took 12 years for the Fish Stocks Agreement to be to enter into force. But you know, we're hopeful that that countries will get the support. For example, the European Union actually is donating $40 million, I believe, or maybe euros, for that ratification effort. So that money will be there to build the capacity of countries. So we shall see. We just, as I talked about earlier, we don't have a lot of time. There's so much changes happening, and you know, climate change is not slowing down. We've already reached 1.5 degrees, and the ocean heat is accelerating, and there's deoxygenation and so forth. So the sooner we ratify this, and countries ratify this, and the agreement enters into force, the better.
I was wondering if, in the process of sort of working on this treaty, if any of the countries have made any major changes in their policies or approaches to how they're using the high seas during the process.
That's a good question. I do not know in terms of countries coming up with different policies. I actually don't know that. Know any country that's changed the way they're using the high seas, so that you're talking about so they can beat the new requirements?
Yeah, or even just sort of the awareness and things
Oh, I see what you mean. Okay, all right. So I was talking to one developing country, small island developing country, and the diplomat was saying that their national legislation is not as strong as the High Seas Treaty legislation, and so they were reviewing that, and she thought it was time to strengthen their level conservation sustainable efforts that are part of their national legislation to match the international standards. So that kind of work, I think, will be ongoing. Some countries will have an easier time doing that. Others will take some time because of political issues, I think, different mandates and a difficulty in getting extra budget and that sort of thing.
That just made me wonder, you've talked about the time and maybe sort of the inertia that it takes to get this ratified. Is there any opposition or is there any pushback to getting it ratified or getting it signed, as opposed to, well, we're just sitting on it, not doing anything?
Right. You mean at a particular country level?
At any level. And commercial organizations pushing back, countries pushing back, politicians pushing back, anywhere.
Right. During the negotiations, there were concerns about benefit sharing associated with marine genetic resources, and that could be one of the reasons that some countries are reluctant to sign. And there are some industry groups that are involved in the discussions with the government officials about how concerned they are about that. So the agreement was adopted by consensus, which means that no single country objected, which is a miracle because this, I mean, of course, the agreement, the negotiators made sure that there would be consensus, but it was during, Russia had invaded Ukraine, and there were political pushback, if you will, that was totally unrelated to the high seas. And there was concern in the room that perhaps Russia would object, but that did not happen. They withheld their objection. They did make comments after the treaty was adopted that they were disassociating themselves from the treaty. So we'll see what happens with that one, but the agreement was adopted by consensus, so.
Thank you. Just a correlative comment to go with what you said. 50 years ago, I had Dean Rusk as a law professor, and he was teaching us, the whole auditorium was full when he taught the class, but he was teaching us about how important it was to get this signed and how difficult it was. So besides teaching us, he was emphasizing those points 50 years ago from his time as a former Secretary of State, and you're still trying to push it through. So there it is.
Well, I think I hope that the voices of scientists are going to continue to strengthen the political will to get the countries to ratify as soon as possible.
So it's coming up in the news again that there's an ocean current at risk of collapsing. I don't know if you've heard about this and if we should actually be scared this time, or because I've seen it in the news before, and my old geomorphology teacher was like, it's overblown, but now it's back in the news, so.
Right.
Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, I read about it. Did you read about it in the New York Times? Yeah, that scientists are, I think the tagline was freaking out about about the ocean. I think scientists are no longer calling it warming because it's more like boiling. And so scientists are using ocean heat content. But the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has a special report that they did for the ocean and cryosphere. And they said in the report that they can't rule out really sudden and unprecedented changes. So I don't know what else to say, but it could happen, where we're going to see major changes. The ice is melting extremely fast, and sea level rise is definitely an issue, and there's going to be a lot of changes coming up in our lifetime, even in my lifetime, which is really scary. So I'm sure I have a daughter who's 18. I'm sure she's really scared.
Let's thank Hiroko for being with us today. It's a fascinating conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Appreciate it.